Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Andres Falcone. I'm a member of the fifth stakeholder engagement team, working on a variety of roles, primarily something very close to my heart, the Stakeholder Advisory Network, and I will be your moderator today. It's 9 a.m. in Washington, D.C. I understand it's 2 p.m. in London and Lagos and other places, something like 4 p.m. in Nairobi, 6:30 in Delhi, 11 p.m. if you are connecting from Japan or Korea. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the sixth webinar on the role of stakeholder engagement in climate action at the local level. We'll be hearing a lot about a brand new study published by CBI, the Consensus Building Institute. We'll be hearing from representatives of the CIF itself, but we also hope to hear quite a lot from you. You are observers, you are stakeholders, you are practitioners in climate action and climate finance. Welcome to everyone, and let's have a look at our work plan ahead. Thank you very much. I am sharing a video screen. If you are connecting through a computer, you should be able to see the slides. Unfortunately, if you're connecting only through a phone or other means, you will not see the presentation. I understand that the session may be recorded and the slides will be shared. I ask for your understanding. We have a short, powerful and ambitious agenda ahead of us for the next hour and a half. We've started very much on the mark. We will do a brief 10-minute warm-up and introductions, welcome and opening. We will then hear from the CIF itself about its stakeholder engagement policies and practices and frameworks, and about the CIF's learning and evaluation component. I understand that this webinar is framed as a learning and an evaluation session for all of us, but we have lots of interests and we are primarily practitioners in this area of climate action, stakeholder engagement. Then we will hear from our main course, the study itself. We'll hear from David Ferman from the Consensus Building Institute, presenting the main findings and recommendations on the study. Lead us to what I expect to be a very lively back and forth question and answer dialogue debate between yourselves, where we will also have a chance to hear back from David and from all of that. We will bring it to a close in 1.5 hours. That's our agenda for today. Before we go further, I would just like to revise those very quick practical tips as webinar guidelines. I understand that we've all been learning and we've scaled up our ability to work in virtual environments over the last month or two, but it's always good to remember that when we're connecting online, when we're having multi-participant sessions and webinars, there are some good practices and etiquette that we can follow. Not all of you may be familiar with this tool, with WebEx. It's quite a powerful resource. It takes some getting used to. So my first tip is, let's try to create a distraction-free environment for the duration of our webinar, so that we don't have to get up, so that we don't have to take care of the cat, the children, or remember that we need to take a quick break. It's just 1.5 hours, so let's stay focused. Please remember the golden rule. Keep your microphone muted when you are not speaking, and in that way we avoid all kinds of background noise that can distract from the main presentation and save us some embarrassment. If you would like to show yourself, if you are connecting through a strong, reliable internet connection, you feel free to turn on your camera. We love seeing faces, especially if you want to make an intervention, you want to pose a question or a comment, turn your camera on. But if you realize that slows down your connection, please turn it off. What's important for us is to hear you. And We can hear you also through a chat window. WebEx has a chat function. You can see a button with a bubble, the chat button. Feel free to use it. Let us know if you have any questions. You can share your thoughts. You can share introductions. You can share any challenges that you're having with connection. I'm assuming if you're hearing me now, you are connected. But if you have any, obviously, if you have any trouble with your connection, we have Renata in our team that is available to help us. I put on the screen her phone number. You can text her, you can WhatsApp her, or email. If you get bumped off, just reconnect with the same WebEx invite button that you've received. I hope that's clear, and let's hope we have a productive meeting to all of us. Before we go into the presentations themselves, I have to say, if we were meeting in person, we have a good quorum here, but we would very likely be doing a very quick round of introductions. We would love to be able to see, put names and faces together, hear a little bit about you even very quickly. I think it's a little bit cumbersome to do that virtually, but fortunately,
I don't know if it's talking where we should put them commuted.
Somebody doesn't have their microphone muted. Good lesson. Please mute your microphone, and we will hear your private conversations. So the internet offers us some very helpful resources to communicate, even if we can't be meeting in person. We have to also acknowledge that there's a very big elephant in the room. We're all greatly affected by it. We're all in the midst of an unprecedented pandemic, which may be affecting us personally, our families, our work, and certainly our planet. So I would just like to ask you, and I would like to invite you to share your views very briefly on how are we doing? How are you doing in terms of coping with this quite unprecedented situation that we're facing? I have just opened a window to a powerful online tool called menti.com. If you connect to menti.com, and some of you are already doing it, and use the code on the screen, you will be able to share very quickly in a word cloud how you're feeling right now. How are you feeling about yourselves? How are you feeling about the webinar? How are you feeling about this world in which we find ourselves thrust into? It'd be great to hear from everyone. How are we doing? Someone is feeling good. We're feeling hopeful, feeling more relaxed. We're also feeling stressed, anxious, worried, curious. Somebody has a lot of family time. Somebody is somewhat concerned. We're worried about an uncertain future. So let's just acknowledge, and let's not pretend that we're carrying on business as usual. These are really unprecedented times. It has opened up quite a number of opportunities, but it has quite a lot of baggage. We're feeling anxious, we're feeling worried, and we have a lot of uncertainty about the future. Let's acknowledge that. Let's get the elephant in the room and out of the room so that we can continue with our work. But I have another question for the moment. And this is about linking specifically the theme of our discussion today, local stakeholder engagement and climate action, with COVID-19. What comes to mind? Again, positive associations, negative associations, whether it's creating opportunities, distracting your work, or anything else. Somebody sees an opportunity. That's travel. Worried about their stuff, I imagine. Risk of being forgotten. We're all part of the solution. We're empowered. We're glad. Feel resilience, support, solidarity. Again, our word cloud is quite mixed. There are certainly linkages between these two crises. It has no doubt affected our work. There may be some upside. There may be a silver lining. Less travel is probably a good thing for most of us and for the planet. But on the other hand, yes, there are risks. There are challenges. There are challenges to the way that we do our work, and we must recognize that. Okay, let's leave it at that. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for sharing. I hope you feel represented in the voices, even if you haven't been able to connect and share your views. And again, it's against this very backdrop of a global pandemic and a global economic crisis that we are discussing local stakeholder engagement. So if that is going to come up again in the discussion, feel free to bring it up in the question and answer session. Last look, and okay. So now, without further ado, I am going to invite my colleague, my boss actually, Dora Kujo, who is the lead operations specialist at the Climate Investment Funds, and actually is the lead on our topic, stakeholder engagement in climate finance for the SIF. Dora will give us a short introduction to the SIF and put all of this discussion into context. Thank you very much, and over to you, Dora.
Clearly? Andres, can you hear me very clearly?
We hear you, yes. Speak loudly.
Excellent. And thank you for the very kind introduction. I must say that if you're calling me boss, then I'm very privileged to be working with the very best. So I appreciate that. Thank you. And one point that flagged from the word cloud, or one phrase which I would want to use as a hook, was all are part of the solution. We all in the same boat. All are part of the solution. And that, I believe, is the underlying reason for the SIF's effective focus on stakeholder engagement. And I also want to acknowledge my colleague, Neha Sharma, from the Evaluation and Learning Initiative within the Climate Investment Fund, for partnering with us for this very timely webinar. And Andres, as you rightly alluded to, and I've also mentioned, the SIF prioritizes its inclusive governance and operational model. And for the next few minutes, I will just give you a very brief overview of the SIF, its structure, elements of the stakeholder engagement program, and most importantly, where we can improve our stakeholder engagement following the recommendations from this recently completed study on local stakeholder engagement. Next slide, please. Excellent. So very briefly, I'm sure you're all very savvy with this, but I thought to quickly mention it that the SIF actually was established in 2008 following a G8 leaders' decision for very fast-moving multilateral response to climate action. And it's quite important to note that that was in 2008 when we had some level of financial fuel crisis. So the issues of climate were still very permanent then. And 4 key areas that were seen as critical were scaled up financing for low carbon technologies, sustainable forestry, coordinated resilience efforts at scale, and demonstration of viability of renewable energy in low-income countries. And very gladly, these became the 4 pillars for the SIPS programs, which are currently the Clean Technology Fund, the Scaling Up Renewable Energy Program, Pilot Program for Climate Resilience, and of course, the Forest Investment Program. And these programs are already in action. And at the moment, we can confidently mention that the SIP's $8.3 billion multi-donor trust fund has leveraged over $53 billion in both public and private co-financing, and currently there are about 300 investment operations ongoing in about 72 countries. Based on the success of the SIFS programs and based on the traction banking on its business model, I'm happy to highlight these 4 bullets down here that as of April 30, the Trust Fund Committee, the SIFS Governing Joint Trust Fund Committee, has given the approval based on the need to scale up rapidly to enable rapid and far-reaching transition in energy, land, urban, and infrastructure and industrial systems, to develop 4 new programs, which are the climate smart urbanization, integration of renewable energy into power systems, nature, people, and climate investment, and of course, accelerating low carbon transition in energy. These are quite great assets, and I believe that's based on the SIPS traction again, and its very innovative business model. Next slide, please. And very, very quickly, you're all very aware, but I thought to quickly mention that the 5 key elements of the SIPS business model, which has helped to facilitate the rapid and systemic climate action, are 1, the SIPS adopted country-led programmatic participatory approach, and this sets the pace for multi-sector transformation, which of course is supported by stakeholder dialogue and engagement of influential champions at the national level. And very quickly, the SIF deliver financing through multiple coordinated multilateral development banks. And these banks expected to work together in a cross-sectoral approach in responding to countries' priorities. The 3rd point quickly is the large-scale coherent investment packages, which is very critical in helping move markets and drive policy reform. The SIFS model also boasts of a scaled-up, predictable, and flexible envelope of concessional resources, which makes it possible to develop influential, often first-of-a-kind projects to address the barriers to climate. And last but not the least, we give due recognition to social inclusion, and at the outset, we ensure empowering women, vulnerable communities, indigenous people, and local communities. And these are the elements that have also very well influenced our stakeholder engagement model. Next slide, please. Very, very quickly, I'm sure you're very abreast with the SIFS structure, but very quickly, SIFS investment operations across the 72 countries we're currently working in are governed by these trust fund committees, what we call the SCF. Let's see, Andres warned me about using acronyms. So the first one is the Clean Technology Trust Fund, and of course that has the Forest Investment Program, the PPCR, or the pilot program for climate resilience, as well as the Scaling Up Renewable for Energy programs in a low-income country. So each of our main pillar programs are managed or governed by a committee. And as you can quite quickly see, the Trust Fund Committee gives due representation for both recipient countries as well as contributor countries. So if I take, for example, the CCF, you can see that 8 recipient countries balanced by 8 contributor countries. And you can also see that for each of the the committees or trust fund committees, we have quite a good representation of observers, active observers. And again, if I may use one example, if you look at the CTF Trust Fund Committee, you see representation from the GEF, UNDP, UNEP, UNFCCC, and of course the UNPSII. And again, in addition, we have 4 civil society representatives, 2 private sector, and 2 indigenous people. And the clear representation for the clear roles of these observers are to give, as the name portrays, an objective view of the views and perceptions of both beneficiaries as well as the contributor countries. And they have this responsibility of being the conduit for bringing issues from their regional constituencies to bear on decisions that are made at the governance level that, of course, has relevance for implementation.
Okay.
Speaking in the background, if you can please mute your microphone. It can happen that if you start speaking, the system will detect your voice and knock off the other speaker. So this will distract and disrupt the conference. I know it's a very easy mistake to make, so everyone understands, but please keep your microphones muted at all times. Thank you. Dora, back to you. We can't hear you.
If you can move to the next slide. So to give a very quick picture of the SIF stakeholder engagement model, I'll leave you with these 5 points. First of all, as I've already mentioned, the SIF thrives in enhancing country-led multi-stakeholder planning at the country level. And here, we duly bring in the role of our civil society, indigenous people, private sector, and local communities to influence the planning phase, the conceptualization of SIF approaches and businesses on the ground, and at the same time, ensure their due representation in the implementation. And as I've already mentioned, the second finger, inclusive and transparent governance. I've already showed you the SIF structure and the substantive representation of non-state actors on the decision-making floor. The third point, quickly on our stakeholder program, is we ensure that our stakeholders are well provided with the capacity to be able to serve as effective conduits between their constituencies and the governance level. And this we do through varied programs such as the regional capacity building workshops, bilateral meetings, one-on-one meetings with our non-state actors. And of course, we ensure also that we are able to participate and bring SIF experiences to bear in events organized by non-state actors. And then fourthly, and Neha is going to be speaking substantively to this, we ensure that whilst we are providing the capacity, enhancing stakeholder support, we create a space to evaluate our work, collect our lessons, evaluate our work so that we can keep course correcting. That's the fourth thing. And the last but not the least is, of course, the SIF supported stakeholder advisory network, which is supposed to be a cross representation of observers, both past and present, from across the climate and environment funds. And here I mean the Soil Carbon Preservation Facility, the Global Environment Facility, the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, and of course the Climate Investment Fund. And the whole point of this platform, a very informal network of networks, provide a space for cross-pollination of ideas, leapfrogging of thought, and to enhance the capacity support that is being provided from across the climate fund to ensure that our stakeholders, or for that matter, observers, are well able to duly represent views and perceptions on the various climate funds. So Andres, I'm done. I hope I did not go too fast, but I'll be happy to step in again when the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dora. I think it's very helpful to situate the SIF, even though many of us are very familiar with it, so we know what kind of stakeholder engagement and in what context we're talking about. Without further ado, I'd like to invite Neha Sharma, who is our lead learning evaluation and specialist, learning and evaluation specialist here at the SIF, and has been in charge with making this independent study happen on the SIF's end. So Neha, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Andres. Just confirming that you can hear me loud and clear?
Yes.
Great. So welcome, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be able to speak with you. As Andres already mentioned, I work as Evaluation and Learning Specialist. The Evaluation and Learning is a special initiative within the SIF that was launched in 2017 to really fulfill the Climate Investment Fund's mandate to become a learning lab for scaled-up climate action. And its purpose is to identify strategic lessons across the SIF's portfolio and enable timely learning not only for the SIF, but also stakeholders in the wider climate finance sector. By the end of this year, we would have published over 30 demand-driven studies through the Evaluation and Learning umbrella. And we really stress on this aspect of demand-driven because most of our work is consultative-based. All of the different topics, approaches, and themes that we are addressing through this initiative were determined through extensive stakeholder consultations. So for example, in setting our new 3-year strategy, we spoke to over 100 stakeholders last year, which included several members from civil society. It included SIF observers. It included members from the Climate Action Network, the Stakeholder Advisory Network, the SAN. So we're really trying to be inclusive in this process. And what emerged were some of the learning priorities that you see on the right-hand side. So transformational change, private sector, development impact, the system design, and local stakeholder engagement and benefit was really at the top of the minds of the stakeholders that we spoke to. And it's continued to be a priority learning theme from us since the beginning of this initiative. And the evaluation that we will be presenting on today is coming from this topical area of work. And we're presenting on one evaluation, but there are other studies coming, particularly on the Indigenous peoples lens and the gender lens. And if you're interested in our work, please do visit the Climate Investment Fund website. Looking at the evaluation and learning page, you'll see a whole list of studies over there. You can also subscribe to our newsletter. And yes, this presentation will be shared with you afterwards, and you'll be able to click on the subscribe link to receive more updates from us on the different studies. The picture that you see on the screen here is from one of our advisory group meetings. So we have an advisory group that really helps us set our strategic direction. And we're really fortunate that some members of this advisory group are actually joining this call, and you'll hear later from Ali Sheikh. And I also wanted to give a shout out to Joe Dickman, who leads the Evaluation and Learning Initiative also in that image. Next slide, please. So I thought I would just introduce this evaluation and sort of make sure that we're all on the same page when we're saying some of this terminology, especially what do we mean by local stakeholders in the context of the SIF and in the context of this evaluation that we're going to present. So local stakeholders, by local stakeholders, we're referring to non-state actors from civil society, Indigenous peoples, local communities, and the private sector. And local stakeholder engagement to us is active participation of these non-state actors in decisions that would impact them directly. And this is important not only as a good development practice to ensure trust and ownership, but ultimately to lead to more effective action on the ground. So when we set out to do this evaluation, we really wanted to learn how local stakeholder engagement was envisioned in the SIF and then implemented in the SIF at various levels of its operation. And it's really important to keep these levels in mind as you hear David present the different findings and the recommendations that came out from this evaluation. And these levels were its governance, and Dora's done a great job of sort of setting the groundwork for this. And so if you remember that slide, we have a trust fund committee, we have subcommittees, and in these committees, observers that are representatives of civil society and local stakeholders have an active role. So we'll hear about findings at the governance level. In the investment planning level, which the SIF undertakes through what we call the programmatic approach, and David will speak about this approach and how local stakeholders were active participants and what that led to. And then in the project cycle, which includes the project design and the implementation phase across different sectors. And finally, the monitoring and reporting. And we'll stress a little bit less on monitoring and reporting today, but the evaluation has good observations. And on this slide, the two documents that you see are also links to these to the evaluation and a short summary. So once you have the presentation, you can click on these and access these documents. I'll just stop there and maybe hand over directly to David to share some of the important findings and recommendations from the evaluation.
Great. Thank you so much, Neha. Thank you, Andres and Dora as well for setting up this presentation on the evaluation of local stakeholder engagement. As mentioned, I'm David Fairman from the Consensus Building Institute. We are a non-governmental, nonprofit organization based in the US that does facilitation and mediation of conflict and collaboration efforts around the world. And part of our work is focused on evaluating and learning from efforts at collaboration in many different contexts, from global to local. It was our pleasure and privilege to conduct this study for the SIF and its stakeholders. And I just want to note at the outset the wonderful support and cooperation we received from colleagues within the SIF administrative unit, colleagues in the multilateral development banks that are the implementing partners, many observers who gave us feedback in different ways, and people at the national and local level, government, local NGOs, and community members who spoke to us We ultimately interviewed over 200 people and then surveyed more in order to conduct this study, so thanks to all. Can I get the next slide, please, Andres? Thanks. So I want to just say a little bit about the way we went about this, and then I'll get into the findings. We started by trying to articulate a theory of change for local stakeholder engagement in the SIF, and I'll say more about that in a minute. But basically, we wanted to understand, as Neha mentioned, the ways in which the SIF's designers believed that local stakeholder engagement would contribute to various outcomes that the SIF thought were desirable. And I'm going to differentiate some of what I say because the 4 programs of the SIF that Dora mentioned took different pathways to local stakeholder engagement. We articulated this theory, then we surveyed a sample of projects and programs, national programs and projects within those programs from the SIF. We had a sample of, as it shows there, 20 SIF projects and 18 investment plans, because we had a couple where we had 2 projects in the same country. And using that sample and a desk survey and some phone interviews, we did an initial assessment. And then we went to 3 countries, Indonesia, Tanzania, and Tonga, did in-depth interviewing and field visits with stakeholders there. So that's the way we went about this. Next slide, please. And our findings are driven by the theory that we articulated at the outset. So I'm going to show you now 3 different slides showing our understanding of what the SIF thought it was trying to achieve through local stakeholder engagement at the 3 levels that Neha mentioned. First at the governance level, then I'm going to talk about country level investment planning, then I'm going to talk about the project cycle. First here at the governance level, this is globally in the architecture of the SIF's trust fund committees and subcommittees, where investment plans are reviewed and approved and projects are reviewed and approved. Remember that the SIF itself is not at the governance level an operating entity. It receives information and proposals from national governments and their MDB, their Multilateral Development Bank counterparts, working through the framework of the SIF's criteria and goals and using the SIF's resources. But at the governance level, we're talking about trust fund committees and subcommittees that receive and review project and program proposals and decide on them, and also set the policies of the SIF and its resource allocations. So at this level, the theory roughly runs that if we have effective engagement of local stakeholders in the trust fund committees and subcommittees, meaning that the observers who are representing constituencies there do that effectively, and national and local stakeholders can raise concerns primarily through the observers, then following the arrow to the right, the trust fund committees and subcommittees are responsive to local stakeholder interests and concerns, meaning that they respond to the input that they view as relevant and that they communicate back to observers and local stakeholders why they decided what they decided. Then SIF policies and programs can be more balanced and legitimate, both in the sense that they balance and integrate global and local stakeholder goals, and in the sense that the stakeholders who are trying to engage at the governance level see the SIF as responsive to them. And in addition, and importantly, that investment plans and projects more effectively integrate local stakeholder interests. That is, they are seen to be and are experienced as meeting both global and local concerns. Again, this idea of how local stakeholder engagement should contribute to the SIF's governance is aspirational. It is the statement that the SIF indirectly and not explicitly has articulated through the design of the observer process for governance and through the engagement of local stakeholders in decision-making, especially about country investment plans and to some extent with regard to projects. Next slide, please. So when we come to investment planning, this again is in the context of the SIF's innovative and important approach to programming at the country level, bringing together multiple government agencies and multilateral development banks and local stakeholders to jointly engage in investment planning. Let me emphasize now, I'll say a little bit more about this as we go, but the 4 different SIF thematic programmatic areas, the Clean Technology Fund, the Scaling Up Renewable Energy Program, the Forest Investment Program, and the Pilot Program for Climate Resilience, PPCR, each had a different approach to country investment planning. They were not identical. And in our findings, we found that the PPCR and the FIP focused much more on local stakeholder engagement in this process by design, the SREP somewhat less so, and the CTF much less so. So while this articulation of a theory of change for country investment programming is broadly applicable across the SIF, not all 4 programs equally emphasized it or articulated it. With that caveat, let me just quickly note here again going through, the idea for local stakeholder engagement was that if you planned effectively for local stakeholder engagement through effective stakeholder mapping and well-informed stakeholder engagement planning, then you would be able to follow through in implementation in terms of representation, the use of forums for stakeholder engagement, information transfer, and consultation processes. And the ultimate result would be investment plans that were well designed, stakeholder benefits that would be more substantial, and the groundwork laid for effective stakeholder engagement in project level implementation. So that's the broad idea of how stakeholder engagement at the programmatic level should contribute to the SIF's goal. Next slide, please. Finally, in the in the project cycle, here we're talking about following through on the objectives and the designs that are established in the programming phase, now going down to the level of individual projects where, as American slang would have it, the rubber meets the road. This is where money actually gets spent in volume to do things that are meant to contribute to the SIF's global goals. You're investing in a new approach to microgrids, or a forest management strategy, or resilience for farmers through helping them with climate smart agriculture. This is the main spending of the SIF's money. It is being spent by multilateral development banks and their government partners primarily, to some extent the private sector, and that's more true on the energy side. But here again, the idea is that if you have effective local stakeholder engagement in the design process for projects, meaning good project consultation with stakeholders, and where partnership is developed, that is, you're actually contracting with or otherwise engaging non-government organizations or business organizations as partners, there's transparency in the setup of those partnerships. Then you will set the groundwork for effective local stakeholder engagement in the implementation of these projects, again, in information sharing, consultation, and importantly, in grievance redress. And that if the project stakeholders are able to engage effectively in using those mechanisms, then you will see stronger project and program results, both in terms of project management and in terms of impact avoidance and mitigation, and overall the ultimate objectives of the project are better met. And finally, in the box in the lower right, this is the transition from the project cycle proper to program monitoring and reporting, where the SIF asks at the national level for its implementing partners to regularly review what's happening in the program and project level activities at the national level, and then come back to the SIF both for accountability and for learning purposes. If you have effective local stakeholder engagement in that monitoring and reporting process, then you will have more effective learning and create a virtuous cycle in enhancing project and program results. Again, this is the aspiration that the SIF's designers and implementers in broad terms set out, with nuance in how this was interpreted in each of the 4 programmatic areas. Next slide, please. So now let me say a little bit more about the findings themselves. So remembering that the SIF's governance model was strikingly ambitious for the time in the depth of observer engagement. That is, observers were asked to actively participate in meetings of these governing trust fund committees and subcommittees to basically an unprecedented level, and to reach their constituencies through a process both of nomination, organized through global bodies, and ongoing consultation. It was a very ambitious approach to observer engagement in the governance level. And the good news is that actually, in broad terms, it's worked quite well. There's clear evidence that observers have been able to participate actively and effectively in these meetings and processes of governance, and that their input has been taken seriously. There are numerous instances that we heard through interviews and also through our survey of observers having raised issues about local stakeholder engagement and gotten feedback. There are also some instances in which local stakeholders went direct and not through observers to raise concerns about national investment programs and particular projects to the trust fund committees and subcommittees, and in some of those cases, there was direct responsiveness to them as well. The areas that could use strengthening now, again, this is the feedback we heard from observers and other stakeholders, are number one, the process for observer selection is uneven in the sense that constituency outreach and participation in selecting observers is pretty uneven, both within and across programs. That can be regional, that can be by sub-constituency, and it's understandable given the global nature of this enterprise, but it is an ongoing challenge. Second, as observers come into the SIF, there is a good onboarding process. Not all observers are equally supported by it, and there are some ways that that process could probably be strengthened. And third, in the ongoing work of observers, it's very important, it's essential to their mandate that they communicate effectively with the broad constituencies that they represent, and that too has been uneven. It's challenging for one observer to represent arguably hundreds of thousands to millions of constituents and to communicate with them, but there's probably more that could be done there, both by the observers themselves and some help that the SIF, AU, and to some extent the NDBs could offer. Next slide, please. On investment planning, again, the positive aspects of the programmatic approach were indeed that, particularly in the PPCR and the FIP, the Pilot Program for Climate Resilience and the Forest Investment Program, where the programmatic approach was structured deliberately for local stakeholder engagement. That engagement was significant, often well-constructed, and often influential on the program design. It was less so in the case of the Scaling Up Renewable Energy Program, and least true for the Clean Technology Fund, where the evidence for local stakeholder engagement in program design is very limited, again, partly by design, but arguably some missed opportunities for the CTF to be more systematic in thinking, even in a targeted way, of which local stakeholders make sense to engage. Beyond the SIF's design and the programmatic interpretation of it, some factors that mattered that were external to the SIF but were supportive were whether there was already a strong local context for local stakeholder engagement. And of course, that varies tremendously by sector and country. But you take an example like Mexico's Forest Investment Program, and you see very strong institutions already in place for local stakeholder engagement and in the forest sector, and you see the SIF and the World Bank in particular, also the Inter-American Development Bank, taking advantage of those. Second, even where capacity building, even where capacity was initially limited, the institutions were relatively weak, there were some great investments in capacity building, as we saw, for example, in Tonga for PPCR and also in Tajikistan, where initial limitations were substantially addressed and the quality, depth, and breadth of local stakeholder engagement improved. And finally, there were some interesting strategic choices made about building on existing forums. In some cases, as in Indonesia FIP, there were some choices made that to create new forums or institutions that didn't work very well. In other cases, like in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, there was a bridging between existing forums and the work of the SIF that led to very effective participation over time. Next slide, please. Going then to the project cycle level, here we saw also some variation. In general, the multilateral development banks are the key drivers of local stakeholder engagement in the project cycle, along with their government counterparts. And that includes both the MDB's own requirements for stakeholder engagement and for their environmental and social safeguards, and also the policies and procedures of their government counterparts. Here, what we saw was that the SIF could make a difference, even though the government and the MDBs were in the lead, if the investment planning process, the distinctive programmatic approach that the SIF had articulated and required at the country level, carried through into project design and implementation. And as I mentioned with regard to investment planning, where the project design also included capacity building investments, in the Tajikistan Pyonch River Basin example, which ADB led with government, is a great one. That could translate very directly into on-the-ground experience. This also happened in FIP in the Democratic Republic of Congo in striking ways. And where that quality carried over, we saw both significant benefits to local stakeholders and good feedback from the project level to the program level. Not all monitoring and reporting processes of the SIF are equally strong in their local stakeholder engagement. Here again, PPCR and FIP are strongest, and by design, SREP has come along recently with stronger program level monitoring and reporting. This is still an area of consideration, and I would say an area for potential improvement for CTF. I'm going to stop there on the findings. There's more to say, of course, about all of these. Next slide, please. I just want to note that the benefits to local stakeholders overall were significant in many cases. I want to highlight the benefits that we saw in cases where the program design explicitly targeted local stakeholders as both beneficiaries and participants. And I'm going to talk about a couple of examples of that in a minute. And a caveat, two caveats. One, that the most marginalized groups, as is often the case in any kind of development intervention, did not necessarily get fully engaged through the SIF's supported programs and projects. So in many cases, women and other marginalized groups, for example, in indigenous peoples in some countries, were not fully engaged, and the disproportionate disengagement there was notable. And second, although it is 10 years on in the SIF's evolution, it's less than 5 years for many of the SIF's projects, meaning that their project cycles are still ongoing, and so benefit evidence is still preliminary. Next slide, please. So very, very briefly, but I want to just highlight a couple of things. In Tajikistan, the Pyonch River Basin project for climate resilience succeeded very well in at least two ways. First, in the programmatic level, in the design of the program where this project was conceived, the capacity and, in some sense, the abilities and focus of the government of Tajikistan on stakeholder engagement were very limited at the beginning of this process. And there was a very strong effort to build up government understanding of the value of local stakeholder engagement and capacity to do it, and simultaneously to identify and engage NGOs, many of whom were very skeptical of a multilateral development bank intervention on climate resilience in Tajikistan, and to help them become more effective in engaging with government. And second, this followed through clearly into the project level, where investments in local community participation in identifying climate resilience risks, in developing interventions for agriculture, for water management, and especially for including women in the conversation and as not just beneficiaries, but active participants in decision-making, were very successful. In the case of forests in Mexico, the Mexico Forest and Climate Change Project was a great example of how sometimes the CIF found a kind of a perfect moment to make an additional investment on top of a pre-existing set of relationships and initiatives that made a big difference. And in this case, the World Bank and Mexico's National Forest Commission and the Inter-American Development Bank had been working collaboratively for over a decade to strengthen the role of ejidos, that is, the institutions for local land management and land ownership in Mexico for forest management. And CIF came in and added a strong climate dimension and added capacity building as well as planning tools through this that made a significant and positive difference. And over 250,000 ejido residents have benefited from that intervention. Next slide, please. So, as mentioned before, there are opportunities to improve at the governance level the way that observers are selected, supported, and how they engage with their constituencies going forward. Second, in investment planning, we recognize that for the moment, the CIF is not doing very much investment planning. It's more focused on implementation of current projects, but given the opening of new programmatic areas that Dora mentioned, we think it's valuable to look at the lessons from the variations in investment planning, local stakeholder engagement in investment planning that we've seen so far, and to think about ways to add to the guidance that the CIF already provides on local stakeholder engagement. Particularly, there's a good guide to stakeholder mapping. More could be done to flesh out that guidance, and to add to that some reporting requirements as part of investment plans so that investment plans can be more systematic and transparent about how local stakeholders were engaged, and the trust fund committees and subcommittees and observers can assess that more meaningfully as they review investment plans. And then at the level of the project cycle and monitoring and reporting, we think there are also ways to be more explicit in including indicators of local stakeholder engagement in the ongoing implementation of programs and projects, and to look for ways to strengthen the participation of relevant local stakeholders in ongoing national level coordination bodies that are set up for the CIF's programs, or in the national coordination bodies that the CIF has joined for its ongoing program coordination. Next slide, please. Just to restate Neha's note, and now I will just emphasize that CBI's non-award-winning report cover is nonetheless the teaser for the report, which gives much more detail on the things I've touched on, and to say that we're happy to take questions both during this webinar and following from colleagues who want to understand better what's in the report. I think that's it for me, so I'll turn it back to Andres. Thanks.
Thank you, David. And thank you for presenting, for going through what was clearly a heavy lift. I mean, there is really a lot there in the report, and I invite all the participants to have a look. At the very least, there's a fine executive summary that is not at all painful to go through. David, you presented a solid conceptual framework, the evaluation methods, the findings, recommendations, and you've couched it with all the necessary caveats. But if I could put you on the spot for a second and ask you, if the sympathetic and responsible media were to pick up on this report, what would the headline be, or what would two headlines be? Is there something that you could say, well, this is what we got?
Yeah. I would say the CIF has made a remarkable commitment to local stakeholder engagement, has followed through unevenly, but with some significant successes, and has the opportunity to level up across the board in the way it does local stakeholder engagement.
That's great. Thank you very much. I hope that was captured, because that would probably make a longish but fine headline. So continuing and into our dialogue and debate, the Stakeholder Advisory Network, or SAN, on climate finance is a partner of this event. The SAN is a network of observers doing the the stakeholder engagement at all these levels, the governance, the project, and at the local level implementation. And a number of our observers would like to make short, brief statements or contributions from their perspective. So if I may invite first Edna Katoyo from Nairobi to share 2-3 minutes, a few thoughts on what we've just heard based on your perspective. Edna, are you with us?
Yeah, Andres, can you hear me?
Loud and clear. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you for the report, CBI, and also the CIF-AU team. We welcome the report. It was a good read, I would say. I had a look at it before as well. My few cents, after looking at the report and also based on my experience as a SREP observer and also as a member of the Stakeholder Advisory Network, I'd say, of course, I acknowledge that there's variation in terms of the depth of engagement of local stakeholders in the different programs in the PPCR, FIP, and SREP, and also CTF. But I think the influence I see in terms of why they are not having the same engagement level, it's in terms of capacity of the stakeholders really to engage, really in terms of their understanding of the process and also procedures of FIP. So for instance, within the Scaling Up Renewable Energy Program, I know a lot of local stakeholders find it technical, for instance, to engage rather than in the FIP when they have the dedicated grant mechanism and a clear understanding of the initiatives that they can put forth, and because it was, developed by indigenous people and local communities. And I think in terms of capacity of local stakeholders to engage, CIF-AU has a greater role, and also the SAN in terms of supporting this at the country level in linking the local people to the CIF country focal point, because that's where I've seen a weakness in terms of linkage to the country focal points and also the MDB who are supporting the implementation, as well as linkage to the national platforms that are there for the stakeholders, like multi-stakeholder platforms. Secondly, in terms of stakeholder engagement, I think resource is a key thing. So enough resource allocation in terms of, the local stakeholder engagement process will ensure effectiveness, and also in terms of mapping out the key social issues. And I think for the other aspects, it's clear. Third, where success in terms of local stakeholder engagement is where there's linkage to and alignment with the National Action Plan, National Climate Change Action Plan, which is linked to the CIF, or where it's linked even to other climate financing that are operational under the country level. In terms of also country level engagement, one key issue is countries really see implementing entities having an understanding on how really to engage the local stakeholders. And I think the CIF needs to really work more on the guidance on local stakeholder engagement, like the how-to, really. And also, at least we have the FIP and PPCR that have had some good lessons that can be learned from and can help strengthen that. And this SAN can help in this arena as well to support the learning. Also, I think key thing I saw in terms of, for instance, the FIP, having exchanges and also learning platforms amongst stakeholders and different actors, like even the CIF learning events, really can help. So how can we downscale that to the country level rather than the regional level, so that we can have more outreach? And in terms of having a stronger observer on board and those who are really connected to their networks, I think SAN is working towards supporting that peer onboarding, because it's going to maintain that pool. And we have to acknowledge the fact that climate finance knowledge is individual, even though we are within institutions, but SAN can help in terms of sustaining such engagement and also help the trickle down of such knowledge back to our different networks. And I think this is something that can be supported by CIF and the SAN itself. And I think as a last point as well is to really call on, really we need further research, especially in terms of looking at engagement in terms of gender, indigenous people's engagement, I mean, at the local level. So that needs more support in terms of, and also looking at how can we develop more better mapping tools to support our local stakeholder engagement. Thank you. I think those are my few thoughts for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Edna. Wow, that's a lot to chew on. And as David has said, there have been great strides and great commitments, but where the rubber hits the road at the local level, there are plenty of challenges and a lot that can be done. Now, from a perspective from a different fund and a different viewpoint, calling in from London, we have Margaret Ann Splon, who is also an observer and a SAN member. Margaret, are you still with us? And please, can you keep
Hello, hi.
as brief as possible?
Yes, of course I will. Hi, can you hear me? Is that all right?
Perfectly, yes.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much, Andreas, and thank you very much for the presentation. It was fantastic and really interesting to see what you've done. So I'm coming at this from a private sector perspective because I'm working not only with the climate investment funds through the Forest investment program, but I'm also the Developed Nations active private sector observer at the Green Climate Fund, and we used to be the private sector observer at the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility. So it's fantastic to see these differences of private sector engagement. First of all, what I wanted to point out from the report that was done is the need for local private sector actors, and not just that, but the need for local stakeholder engagement and not one size fits all. This is parallel when you think about it in terms of the just transition means, which points out how place-based solutions are so important. And I think that that's what the report really pointed out is even with the best intentions of local stakeholder engagement, the results aren't necessarily all going to be uniform. So well done on that. And then the second point that I'd really like to point out is this stakeholder advisory network that I am part of as well, and I'm also working with Lad, Connell, and Cynthia Greers, as well as you, Andreas, on the fundraising for this. And I really see this as a fantastic opportunity for observers to get to really work together, because even though we represent different communities, let's say Indigenous people or women or civil society, and we serve our different constituency groups, but we're united in the communality of wanting to serve our constituency groups in the most appropriate and best manner. And currently, observers have a finite amount of time, and having actually a framework and a guidance under the Stakeholder Advisory Network, I think is a fantastic opportunity for us to pull together as a community of observers with a view to increasing climate action within these programs. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Margaret. And if we can go to another part of the world and a much later time in the day, to Islamabad, I'd like to forward to Ali Sheikh. Ali, are you with us? Ali, if you are there, you are muted. We don't hear you. Hello? I see you. You are unmuted, but we can't hear you. Okay, without further ado, I will call on our next discussant, Freeman from Nigeria, and we'll try to get back to Ali. Freeman, are you with us? We're very keen to hear your local perspective.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, speak up, please.
All right, I'm Freeman, a lawyer from Nigeria. I'm going to speak from civil society on the report. First, CBI have done a very good report and it's actually commendable. But there are a few issues I would actually like to highlight. Local stakeholders are trusted and helpful partners, and they are good project watchdogs. But the challenges they have had over time in having impact being fed in systems and in projects is that when they lack capacity, 95% of NGOs, CBOs, and community groups, they have knowledge, for instance, climate change, then they can do actually advocacy. But the integral part of renewable energy projects, they actually don't know. They actually don't get involved because they just keep talking and they don't keep doing it right. So one, the capacity building it will help to increase trust level, transparency, and participation. And personally, I would, hello?
Go ahead, we can hear you.
Okay, I thought I saw a comment. So, if you want a better local stakeholders engagement, you need to engage CSOs, CBOs, and local groups at the early stage of planning. The conceptualization of the project is key for you to have these groups involved, including gender. Now, because they want transparency, they want proper benefit sharing, and one thing is key to all of them, despite the culture, religion, and belief, the success of the project. So I will go to what CFI has actually done, and we saw from the CTF project. They've actually mainstream, and you can see that you have more successes. But the truth is, there are problems selecting some of these organizations and this group. In life, they say, information is power. There are some organizations that might not be privileged to be on the internet by virtue of website or by virtue of contact to get to knowledge of being mainstream in activities, but they have capacity or they have the local visibility. So such organization can actually not be picked or selected. That is a challenge. So, and I know it is difficult for CIF or these developmental banks to go around the countries and start picking organizations. So what I would advise is, in my own personal observation, is it is good for current observers to have a way of monitoring them. They should actually deliver report of their activities back home. It is true, some of them had initially local contact with their constituency and have programs and projects. But the moment they are taken on board, they lose this connection with the people. Therefore, it is good to have a mechanism of checking their consistency and their constant touch back home to their constituency and the project. Two, they can do this. They can also keep writing reports. You do a report, and in that report, you put pictures of the programs that are verifiable. Picture, they said, speak loudest. Then for national projects at the country level. Now, the truth is, if you look at the project you are doing, it's either in South America or, thank God, we have one in Zambia that was successful. In West, we hardly have projects because even the government itself does not have the capacity to drive climate projects. They rather employ or engage consultants write projects, and if they manage to win, you should know that it will not work drive, except this developmental body come will say, we are giving you a project. For that reason, and I also know that CSOs are given a space in each project, but the government will choose to take own organization, those ones set up by themselves as part of the project. So personally, I will also suggest that while you are giving government at national level in program implementation opportunity for them to have CSOs to be part of it, to write reports, to see what is happening, have your own 2 CSO that you will mandate to join project. But it is not about giving out your money, because CIF focuses initially from the report says implementation of project, and the initial stage of plan is not there. So give national government opportunity for project and to have CSO, because they are going to have their own privilege, or sometimes some right one will fall in. But the truth is, have your own 2 CSOs or 3 that will monitor activities and let you know. The government is actually afraid of this. So for me, I think if you want the programs of CIF to gain grant and you have a good return on investment, what you are doing right now is very, very key to the successes. But the challenge is, one, it has been overemphasized. The capacity of these CSOs are not adequate. Train them on renewable energy, train them on climate mechanism, forest this, carbon emission this, carbon calculation, and those are things you can help them. Then 2, as you are doing this, get your system to monitor the CSOs that are being mainstream. Support them with finance. Even if you have finance in the project, give your own finance out directly to the CSOs to do more. Because without finance, they can't do more than what they can do, because the government have the tool to maneuver, to control. But it takes a dogged CSO, leaders, and organization to achieve success. Then finally, as observers, it is true that you have a lot of responsibilities, report writing, and activities, but they are actually less cared for. So you can hardly have time to get to do other things or engage your community. So one challenge I see with the observer who are currently up there losing engagement with their local community is that it is possible they have a lot of workload and they actually have less time to drive for funds in order to do projects. So personally, I think observers should be supported more, so that even while they are on the board of as observers and on projects, they can do more. So that is what I think we should do. So CSOs, early involvement, monitoring, and planning from the stage is important. Thank you.
Thank you, Freeman. Thank you for bringing the focus to the capacities and the needs of the observers doing the work on the ground. We know that it is that it is a challenge, and that you have to juggle quite a number of demands. I wonder if we can try to loop in back Ali before we take a few more spoken interventions, and we have a lot of comments and questions coming into the chat windows that I have asked our speakers to speak back to. Some of them are being answered on the chat window itself, so please keep your windows open and have a look. There's a lively debate going on in there, but we also will ask David and our SIF representatives to share some thoughts. These thoughts can be on the report itself, on the recommendations of the report for the SIF, but also on your local experience and on the generalization of the findings, either to climate finance, to other climate funds as a whole. Ali, do you think you can join us now? Let's give it a try. Ali from Islamabad? And I'm afraid not. We did try this earlier and it did work, the perils of technology. So would anyone like to share a question or very, very brief comment before we go back to our main speakers? Raise your hands or don't all speak up at once.
Address. This is John Garrison. I do have a question for David Farman.
Go ahead, John.
You hear me? Okay, yeah. So my question is, first of all, congratulations on a well-structured and comprehensive study and clear report findings. My question is, in those countries where the observer participation was low or non-existent in the strategy, program design, and project monitoring work, what were the key factors for this? Would it be resistance from local governments or local MDB offices? Or was it lack of observer experience and capacity, or a combination of both? Thank you.
Okay, David, hold on to that one. I'd like to take a few more. I am delighted to see that we have had close to 100 people participating. So this is an all-out success as a webinar so far, but I would like to hear your voices.
Can I say something otherwise? Can I point out one? Yeah, just following up on the observers, I would hope that kind of, it's slightly that I disagree slightly with what Freeman has said, is the fact that if you're an observer and if you're representing civil society, then you should be able to represent that as in, i.e. the private sector, and reach out to your constituencies, and you should have a large constituency. I'm not saying that the CIF shouldn't help or shouldn't help coordinate that, but in fact, you're often chosen for your expertise and knowledge of climate, of energy, of a variety of things. And if you don't know those, that is part of, that's the whole self-selection process, is so that whatever constituency gets the best, most effective, or most well-connected person in their observer, network, so that they can represent, because not everyone can know everything, but it's certainly really about forming together knowledge sharing and supporting your own constituency group. Thanks.
Thank you, Margaret. Anyone else? No, don't be shy.
Hello, Andres, can I pick that? Okay.
Okay, two at once. That's him? Or yes?
Yes, hello, Andres.
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity to make a few comments. Thank you for the webinar as well. The report was really great. The points shared are very great, and I really like the recommendations that were given. But I have some few concerns. In the recommendation, it was highlighted that, one of them, the first one was enhancing observer selection, onboarding, and constituency representation. There are a couple of them, and my concern is, or my question is whether the CIF has a stakeholder engagement policy, which at least could guide this stakeholder engagement that we are talking about. And then I think that is my main concern about that. And then also with regards to, I think somebody has raised that already, with regards to areas where the research found out that stakeholders engagement was a bit low. Can the recommendation have, the recommendations that he gave, can we be very specific, especially if we can take into consideration some of these places that stakeholder consultation was quite low? If we can have specific recommendation on how to move forward. I'm not sure if the projects have ended, but if they haven't, there should be specific recommendations that will shape the future implementation of such projects. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I want to strike a deal with all of you. We're in the last official 10 minutes of our webinar. I'm going to hand the floor to David, Nora, Neha, if she would like to add something in response. We did run a little bit late, some 10 minutes or so behind schedule. So after David and others speak and respond, we're more than happy to extend our session by 10 minutes or so for those that are available. We will hear from them first so that we can hear their final thoughts on time, and those of you that are punctual and have other commitments can leave. But we will be happy to stay logged on for another minute, a few more minutes, and take more comments. So David, could we hear from you on some of the questions and comments that were addressed about the study itself and its findings and recommendations?
Absolutely, and I want to thank everyone who took the time to read the study and to comment, and those of you who just responded to what you were hearing today. A lot of great input. I wanted to speak briefly and selectively to three topics: capacity, the role of the Stakeholder Advisory Network, and the question of conflict among stakeholders. On capacity and the need to build capacity and how to do it. First, we need to differentiate between observers at the global level in governance and the local stakeholders at the national and the project levels. For observers, our recommendations are very much geared to the process of identifying candidate observers based on the strength of their networks. And then once they are onboarded, giving them more tools and supports for communication and engagement, which could include more explicit focus when there are new national programs being developed on identifying national counterparts who are interested in the program and making sure that observers are aware of what's going on at the national level a little bit more systematically. What we found was that observers knew a lot about their own countries, and it was a little bit of a random draw whether observers were fully able to understand what was going on in other countries where they had networks or counterparts. For local stakeholders themselves at the national and the project level, there's good practice, substantial good practice in PCR and FIP to build on, and some in SREP as well. I don't want to restate the things that I already mentioned. I just want to emphasize that stakeholder mapping and the identification of existing forums to build on, and then the explicit identification of capacity gaps in the early stages of investment planning are critical. If you, in investment planning early, see that your government counterpart does not have strong capacity to engage, and or you see that local stakeholders who are logical, through your stakeholder mapping, you've identified them, do not have strong capacity to engage, that's the time to make investments. And we think that the budget available for local stakeholder capacity building ideally could be increased and focused on addressing gaps that are identified. Second, with regard to the Stakeholder Advisory Network, it was not a primary topic for us to investigate the SAN, and we didn't see a lot of SAN activity that directly related to the implementation work of the SIF. If the SAN is able to actively support observers and to create stronger ties between observers at the global level and countries at the national level in which the SIF has programming, we think that would be fantastic. And the more experience sharing and help for new observers during the onboarding process, the better. And I'm sure there are many other things that SAN can do that I simply don't know about, but those two are clear conceptually to us. Finally and briefly, with regard to low levels of capacity and with regard to conflict among stakeholders, I just want to make a couple of general points. Like any other multilateral development initiative, the SIF enters into national contexts where there is history, there is conflict, there is often problematic governance, there are problems of transparency and accountability, there is low capacity of stakeholder groups. There is competition among NGOs for limited resources, whether national or from international counterparts. The CIF has no magic wand to fix these pre-existing conditions. It must enter in with eyes open at the programmatic level. It must do careful analysis of stakeholder interests, resources, and conflicts, and the people who are working in the MDBs and their government counterparts need to think carefully about what to do when conflict appears likely among stakeholders from the beginning. One of the most important things that can be done is to create a forum in which concerns can be aired and problem-solving orientation can be developed. Often independent facilitation is useful. Indonesia, in the case of FIP, provides a very interesting example of the efforts to resolve conflict among and between NGOs and government in order to move forward with the program and using a national counterpart institution as a quasi-mediator. But the main headline here is, you bet there's going to be stakeholder conflict, and you bet there's going to be low capacity to deal with it in many places. It's the CIF's job to find ways to address that. We have good tools and methods and approaches for conflict identification and conflict management. It would be great if the CIF could become systematic in using them where appropriate. Over. Thanks, Andres.
Thank you very much. Never try to speak when you're on mute, as I just did. Dora, we'd like to hear from the CIF, perhaps in response to some of the comments, but I also know that the CIF has taken this study very seriously and has read the recommendations with interest and is prepared to respond to these recommendations. So could we hear from you about what the CIF is doing about this?
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you so much, Andres. And I fully appreciate all the very objective feedback.
If there's any way you can speak up a little bit louder, that would help us. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Andres? Andres, can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you. Go ahead, but speak,
okay.
Speak loudly. Your voice is a little bit lower than other participants.
Okay. All right. I just wanted to duly acknowledge all the comments that are coming in, the feedback, some recommendations, all pointed to enhancing the CIF's ability to take up the recommendations that have been provided. I would quickly say that, yes, from our standpoint, and as we have rightly pointed out, although we are doing from our capacity enough to enhance the representation of our observers, both at the governance level and also to strongly engage with our MDBs who are in charge of implementing interventions on the ground using their own innovative stakeholder engagement models in addition to the CIF's proposed. We are also keen, and as I've mentioned, ensuring that we are doing a continual listening, a continual course correction, and as a result, have undertaken the study. So let me quickly mention that one point that has always come out quite strongly is the extent to which we ensure the transparency and the scope of the selection process to ensure that, one, we have due recognition or due space for bringing in a wider, knowledgeable scope of observers or non-state actors to participate on our trust fund. So in this case, what we are trying to do is be as creative and innovative as possible, enhancing the reach of our announcements that go out to inform potential interested stakeholders so that they can be aware of and they can submit their expressions of interest. One thing we also do is the CIF does not manage it. The selection itself selected is as in observers go through a self-selection process. So it's also essential that we engage an independent organization. And again, here, looking at the scope of representation on the SUN, we intend to fully engage the SUN in this new round of selection to ensure that, again, we can bring in the best and we can bring in ones of observers who do not just sit as active observers, but have the capacity to inform, to guide, and to contribute to meaningful dialogue, meaningful policy discussions at the global level. At the national level, of course, we realize that meaningful and effective engagement of stakeholders is critical to a good extent. And let me put on my old hat. I used to work in South Asia, in Bangladesh, in Nepal, implementing self-funded activities. And I could really easily see the value addition to ensuring that non-state actors are brought in early on in the process, in the design of the investment programs. Yes, the process will be longer in terms of the design, but you can be assured as a development partner or an implementing agency that the priorities that will be selected will be ones that are owned and led by local communities. So that's one thing we ensure. So the CIF has adopted a stakeholder mapping tool. And of course, there's room for improvement, and I've learned from one or two comments, there is room for us to strengthen the actual implementation of the mapping tool. A document in itself does not help, but it has to be translated into actual implementation. Another point is the program monitoring. For us, it's critical that they just don't engage in the planning phase and the implementation phase is left hanging. But we want to sustain. So as part of the process, the CIF engages, undertakes what we call stakeholder meetings during implementation of projects. We also do policy meetings at the national level. My latest was in Cambodia, where through some intervention support to non-state actors, we're able to pool a large mass of different, a diverse group of stakeholders together to discuss safe-supported interventions to ADB. So the ground level consultations or ground level communication is one that we hope to be able to strengthen in partnership with our MDBs. And let me quickly close. I'm sure there are lots of recommendations coming in, but let me quickly mention that we are not in any way trying to say we have hit the ceiling of our ability to improve. There's still room for improvement, and we take delight in learning the experiences and lessons from other climate funds. And here I would say that the whole idea of the sun is to convene these different ideas so that we can leapfrog rather than having to start some innovative thinking from scratch. If we can tap into experience from another fund, or we can better still share experiences, the sun provides a space for effectively doing this. So we hope to be able to sustain the support being given. And of course, Margaret Sloan and other representatives of the sun, I think if the sun can, run at the pace that we can follow, that will be an asset. And very lastly, capacity. Yes, we realize that some of our observers have a challenge with being able to effectively convene ideas from the different constituencies. But there are also a few who have done this quite excellently. So what we are doing is a couple of video interviews to understand how a few who have been successful have done it. So there's some level of peer-to-peer learning. And I think for our observers, for the CIF observers, if we can solidify or strengthen the collaboration or the learning across observers themselves, they're good lessons to share. We are not running away from the challenges with that process, but I feel that there's room for learning from the few good ones. And also this COVID issue has somewhat changed the dimensions in terms of engagement. Now there's no space other than using virtual means. And of course, there are few good lessons, and we're hoping to pick in on some of the experiences from this COVID-19 quarantine space to be able to inform the use of the use of media, the use of other non-face-to-face communication to strengthen our constituency representation. So I can keep going, but let me land here and give space for more contributions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dora, and thank you for sharing your thoughts and the perception of the CIF of the opportunities that we have. I think we've covered a tremendous amount of ground, and there were quite a number of suggestions, recommendations, or actually emphasis on some of the findings of the study itself. We looked at the need to map stakeholders and plan early interventions pay off. We looked at capacity and capacity gaps and different types of capacity. We looked at the need and the opportunity to link governance level stakeholders and observers and local implementation observers. We also looked at the role of the Stakeholder Advisory Network as a convening body that could leverage the voice and address some of those gaps. We're now running 5 minutes over time, so and we have completed our formal agenda. We've heard back from you and from the presenters. So any of you that need to log off at this point, we won't take it personally. We'll miss you. But if those of you that are willing and available, if you'd like to stay on board, I think the dialogue has been quite good. We have a very full room, so we would love to take a few more questions and comments. There have been some people raising their hand, and I would like to start with Zakir. But thank you to everyone for sticking around this far. Zakir, are you with us?
Hello, Andres. Thank you for the lively discussion, and salute to David for the courageous report. It seems to me that he's from local people. In fact, all we are local people. And of course, salute goes to CIF to acknowledge and approve the report. Full of courage, that is unusual for World Bank. I have an issue with the local stakeholder itself. It is established that a bunch of local elites, they have the majority project benefit rather compared to the mass local people. So is it possible that or can we define local stakeholder in CIF projects to include all of society, not the vested group, elite group, or poor group, women group, or disabled group, but all of society, so that I think it will be much more beneficial to local people. The other issue is constituencies. That we are missing a couple of constituencies like farmers constituencies, children and youth constituencies. So how CIF can include those constituencies as well? And I had also another issue with the rivalry between the climate funding mechanisms globally. But I have some documents from NEHA already, so that I can look forward to it. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dora.
Thank you, Zakir. I think we would love to hear you, if you have comments you'd be keen to share in writing about how stakeholder representation can be enhanced and improved. As we all know, it is difficult to reach out to those that are most vulnerable, and it is a constant challenge. So any contribution as to how to make all of society benefit or all of society be represented would be most welcome. It can get very technical also to make stakeholder voices heard. So we'd love to hear your thoughts. Any other final comments or contributions before we sign off?
Andres, may I jump?
May I speak?
Yes,
please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you for the presentation, and I just had some observation. When we talk about capacity, I believe that capacity is built through experience.
Mm-hmm.
That experience can be obtained at the local level, regional level, and international level. So I would just like to ask a question to the CIF. I'll take, for example, the English-speaking Africa, Anglo. So I would like to know, how do they? I know the observers are selected by the like, let me talk about the indigenous people, by the indigenous people in that region. So how do you actually ensure or try to let me say try to give directives on bringing on board countries that doesn't have that many representatives that could vote for them, to eliminate imbalances in, like, maybe having a country with many indigenous people who are active produce observers year in, year out. So that's what I wanted to know, because there might be something. There was a process that was started, and the late Daniel Sabit was there, and I don't know how it went, because there was too much politics around it. So how do you ensure that the other countries in the same region are given a chance to produce observers and get the experience through that position and stuff like that? Thank you.
Thank you, Martha. Again, it's another question about how to enhance and ensure effective stakeholder representation. Any other final comments before we round up?
Yeah.
One, perhaps.
Quickly, John, are you hearing me?
Yes.
Andres, thank you. Dora, thank you for the opportunity. Thank you to the CIF family. So I listened to the discussion, and I quickly want to draw a few points from the discussion. So we all know that CIF doesn't have the magical wine to produce all of the needed results, but we can collectively work together. And we talk about transparency, capacity, and for LSE, and the way we can build our capacity. You mentioned it in the report. You talk about the overall political economy for LSE. Now, if they have a good economy for them, it would strengthen their existence in forum across. And you also talk about limited government interest in engagement with private sector and civil society group. This is a point I just want to brief up to everyone. The reason why we have limited interest of government in stakeholder and civil society group is because the stakeholder do not identify as to which mean they should address the government. I will give you an example from the youth sector. So from the youth sector, the youth wait for government and multilateral development banks to come up with policy, and then they work with it. And I would suggest to the youth and the LSE to produce policy and engage the relevant authority to implement these policies. With that, you will have ownership, and the government will work with you. With that, you can reduce the level of gap or backfill within the LSE. Yeah, so since we already know that the CIF reason for LSE is to advance programmatic goals and for good development practice, I will appeal to the CIF family to see reason to build a government to local advisory network in every country that you have a project plan design going on. That'll be my suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you, Isaac. So as we prepare to wrap up, I will give the floor to the SIF for final comments. And as I say farewell to you, I would like to thank you, thank our partners, congratulate you for being an incredible, active, and participatory audience. I don't know about you, but just this couple of months ago, whenever we tried to hold a webinar or an online meeting, chaos ensued with technical problems, connection problems, people not following the proper etiquette. I think, again, if we look at the silver lining and the upside of this COVID crisis, is that we have become so good at teleworking, so good at communicating in distance, and our carbon footprint is is drastically removed at the same time that we're achieving results that would not have been able to achieve had we done this meeting in person in a small room or in a small auditorium in Washington. So thank you very much. This was a lively debate. I'm very privileged to have been able to facilitate this discussion. I would like to give the floor to Neha for final comments and Dora for wrap-up. Thank you very much to David as well and to all of you.
Thanks, Andres. And I won't take long at all, just to say, just appreciate so much the interaction and the participation. This seems like the first of many conversations because there are many unanswered thoughts and questions and reflections. So we might organize something similar again. Really nice to see that technology is working and allowing for this participation. And just in closing, I wanted to mention something I already mentioned on the chat, but for those who didn't see it, we've just launched Just Transition initiative at the Climate Investment Funds because we're very keen on exploring aspects of inclusivity and equity and looking at social development impacts on CIF investments through a social inclusion lens and looking at broader issues and of trade-offs and marginalization and vulnerability for different groups. So those who are interested, I put the link in the chat. Please do look at this initiative. And many of you are already part of our Transformational Change Learning Partnership. But if you're interested in some of the work that we've done on transformational change and now on Just Transitions, there'll be an email address. Andres, I don't know if you have a slide with our email addresses that we can put up, but if not, I'll just leave it in the chat function. And yes, there we go. So please feel free to write to us if you'd like to learn more about any of the evaluation and learning initiatives. Thank you.
Over to you, Dora.
And Dora, maybe, over to you, Dora.
Okay, I wanted to echo what Neha had just said to show our utmost appreciation for such an interactive session. I must say we knew it was going to be very successful because of the rich engagements we have been having with you over the series of regional consultations, national meetings, global events. But we did not foresee it being this enriching and this informative, targeted with key questions on how we can even create a space to better engage with you. We have duly heard your interest in looking more into how to apply for your interest in the new selection of observers, taking into account the new programs that are coming on board. And also we've noted your concerns about how do we ensure that we can break that low stakeholder engagement in some of the programs. These are all very valid. And we would keep track of all these points that have been shared as we have been doing, noting our interest in continual self-check in our evaluation work. We will update as time goes on the actions that have been taken to address the key gaps in the study that has been completed. We would also be posting the video, hopefully not in a very lengthy form, but in a form that you can access if needed to check in on some of the issues that were flagged. If your questions were not captured we tried our best to address questions as they came through the chat window. But if you feel there were any issues that were not addressed to your satisfaction, please do not hesitate to send us an email. We would want to keep that open door communication with you all. And also we are grateful that we can keep going forward as you do the monitoring on our behalf to ensure that we are using the resources and the materials being provided by the state in a way that meets the needs of the most vulnerable communities, the most vulnerable to climate on the ground. Permit me a second to also thank my team members, Ms. Neha Sharma, for such great support, to Andres for doing this so efficiently. Andres, I think you need to put this on your resume. And to Renata, who ensured that technically everything went perfectly together, ensuring you got the messages on time and were able to efficiently provide your comment. This is teamwork. And again, as we started, and I quote what was said in the Metimeter, once someone said, all are part of the solution. We cannot do CIF cannot do climate action alone. We will continue to count on your engagement. We'll continue to count on that inclusive agenda. And we believe that with the new programs, there's more room for even much more effective action on the ground. Thank you very much for your time, and we will be reaching out to you again. Thank you. I guess with that, I say thank you and bye for now. And hopefully we'll be in touch by email, by WhatsApp, whichever form. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye for now.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Opportunity.
Bye.
Bye, Cecile.